Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Today, we're going to be discussing tackling Scope 3 emissions in purchased goods and services. It's a topic I'm really excited to discuss. We'll be diving through and got two great colleagues here from our partner network who are going to provide some more insight into some of the work that they're doing, as well as how they've helped either customers or clients navigate the tricky world of getting the correct data and doing purchased goods and service emission calculations. Before we start, though, I'm Mitch Voss, Senior Director here at Sustain Life. I lead both our technical as well as our services practice, and excited to introduce our two guests here. Noah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, hey everyone, Noah Jakovac. I'm a consultant at MHP and head of our sustainability practice. A little bit about MHP. We're a 100% owned subsidiary of Porsche. We're a premium business and technology partner working to shape the future of mobility and manufacturing. A little bit about my team. I'm on our digital advisory team here in the US, and we focus on strategic business outcomes through strategic assessments, organizational change management, and then, of course, sustainability. And I believe that sustainability is super important because it's essential that it be a thread throughout an entire company across every division. And of course, that comes with the IT and all of the strategic processes associated. I'll hand it over to Tad.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tad Radzinski, and I'm the president and one of the co-founders of Sustainable Solutions Corporation. We've been in business since 2001 doing sustainability, and our company really focuses in on sustainable engineering practices. So we're in the trenches every day working with many different clients of ours to understand how they're going to reduce the impacts in their operations and in their products and working in their supply chain. We're conducting many life cycle assessments for many companies, and we are very busy right now helping companies understand, measure, and report their Scope 3 emissions based on the new regulations that have come out and everything else that's driving the market. So I'm excited to be here today and get to talk to all of you. I have been very active in the sustainability world. I've been an adjunct professor teaching sustainability at Villanova University since 1998, and we bring a lot of our knowledge and information into the educational platform. So that's why I really love doing webinars like this, so we can teach others on how important it is to understand these concepts and be able to utilize them to basically try to empower more positive global change, which is the mission of our company. So great to be here, and thank you, Mitch and Noah. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Tad. Thanks, Noah. So before we start and dive into PG&S emissions in particular, just want to give a quick background on Sustain Life. So those of you who are unfamiliar with Sustain Life, we're a decarbonization SaaS platform, and we focus on supply chain engagement and decarbonization of Scope 3 emissions. Our suite of carbon calculators and the auxiliary tools that we have really enable businesses to measure their emissions across Scope 1, 2, 3. We also work with companies to set science-based targets, actually engage their suppliers, harmonize the disclosure as well in terms of making sure that they're aligned to any ESG reporting requirements they may have, and really drive meaningful progress throughout the value chain. So thanks for joining us today. Where we're going to start, this might be old hat for folks on the call today, but really grounding ourselves in what we're talking about in terms of PG&S emissions. So what we're looking at is our Scope 3 emissions, in particular, our purchased goods and services. And really, again, for those who might not be familiar, Scope 3 emissions are your value chain or indirect emissions. It has 15 categories as defined by GHG protocol, and we're really focused on category 1 today, which is purchased goods and services, which come from your supply chain. In terms of an agenda and what we'll go through, here are the key pillars that we really want to discuss and dive into. The first one will be drivers for measuring PG&S emissions. So why are companies doing this? What's pushing them towards engaging their supply chain and getting the emissions that they need from their suppliers, as well as challenges that arise in that process. So, challenges with data, challenges with setting up that program and really driving meaningful collaboration throughout your supply chain. We'll go over some obstacles to success, choosing the right method for calculation. I think this will be a really key topic for us to dive into a little further, talking about the different methods you can use to do the calculations and what might be best for your business or what might make you most successful with your program. We'll talk about supply chain strategies. Tad has a few case studies to share, and we'll finish with key takeaways. With that, we'll go into our first topic, which is drivers for PG&S emissions. I'll pass it off to Tad at this point to talk about what he's seen with his clients and the work that they're doing.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, one thing for sure that we've seen, for many years, we've been doing sustainability work, and initially you saw commitments and requirements by the investment community and banks and different things like that in terms of publicly traded companies getting pressure to start reporting how they're dealing with climate and GHG emissions and different things like that. And then we started to see more movement in terms of regulatory. And one thing that we're seeing is the recent regulations that have come out. For example, California Senate Bill 253, which is requiring any companies that are doing that are over $1 billion in revenue that are doing business in California need to start reporting in 2026 and 2027 in their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So suddenly this opened up a whole new realm, because many companies were like, oh, we're kind of under the radar because maybe we're not publicly traded or we're smaller or whatever. However, regulations like that, where it's now requiring both public and private entities to report, has suddenly opened up a lot of concern by companies that have never done any of this. So we've been getting requests from multiple companies, actually fairly large companies, which I was surprised about, that haven't been really, focusing on this, to number one, get their scope 1 and 2 measured, which is something that we work with. We use SustainLife quite often for that, but they're also trying to navigate and understand their scope 3. So scope 3 is definitely driving that. Many of the companies we work with also are doing business in Europe, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that's CSRD, that, as you see on the slide here, is another big regulation that's coming down and requiring reporting and tracking of GHG emissions, especially scope 3. And then one thing, I don't know how many folks are on here that are doing any kind of federal contracting, but the federal acquisition regulations are recently being promulgated right now. I worked for the EPA for 10 years as their waste minimization national expert, and we do a lot with companies that sell into the federal government. And the federal government has a whole movement around sustainable purchasing and different things like that, low embodied carbon products and all kinds of things. And these new federal acquisition regulations are going to require any entity or company that's doing business with the government over $50 million a year, as it's written right now, to report scope 1, 2, and 3, but also set science-based targets. So these things have really changed the market in a big way, these different regs. And now the Securities and Exchange Commission has come out as well. And originally, everybody was thinking that SEC was going to require reporting of scope 1, 2, and 3. However, the regulation as published right now is only requiring scope 1 and 2. However, I will say we have a number of companies we're working with that we've been talking to, and they're like, well, we've never had to report anything, but we are doing business in California. So now we're going to have to be prepared to do our scope 1, 2, and 3 there. And we also are selling our, materials to others. And the people that are buying our materials are now saying, hey, we think eventually SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is going to require scope 3. So we're going to need you as a supplier to us to start really measuring and doing your own thing. So those kind of things we're seeing quite often. On the voluntary framework side, I would say, there's been a lot of movement in terms of, for a few years now, a good number of years, people reporting to CDP, basically getting that information in there. A lot of entities out there are getting pressure, so we talked about regulatory, but let's talk about a big company that's getting pressure maybe from a retailer. Let's say it's a pharmaceutical company, and a retailer is saying, hey, we really want you to contribute here and start driving down your emissions, or even a whole industry like the pharmaceutical industry, which is really pushing on setting science-based targets as, a collective under the pharmaceutical supply chain initiative and things like that. There's all these initiatives going on where we're seeing a lot more movement around companies setting science-based targets. And for those of you that aren't totally familiar with those, that's basically a commitment by a company to set near-term and long-term targets towards reducing their GHG emissions in the near term, but then being net zero in most cases by 2050 to be in alignment with the Paris Accord of maintaining these targets to prevent basically global warming from exceeding the 1.5 degrees C. So this is something that I've seen where bigger companies are setting these goals and they're doing science-based targets, but now we're seeing them pushing it down into the supply chain. We have some companies that reached out to us. They got a letter from, say, a pharmaceutical industry, and they're like, hey, this is telling us we have to report our scope 1, 2, and 3. We've been measuring scope 1 and 2, but we don't even know what our scope 3 is. And they also want us to set science-based targets. What are those? So we're going to talk a bit about maturity in the supply chain, but that's just an example of how this pressure is just trickling down, from these different frameworks and drivers looking to reduce these impacts. And for most of you, if you've done your scope 3 baselining and hotspot, you probably are a company, depending on what sector you're in, you probably are going to find that over 90% of your emissions are going to be related to scope 3 in most cases, unless you're in mining or you're in steel, where you're basically using a lot of fuels to make products and things like that. But many companies we're seeing, some of them are even at like 98% is scope 3. And of that, a huge percentage is purchased goods and services, because they're like buying all these different products and materials and ingredients, and they're assembling something and selling a final product. So this is where it gets really interesting in terms of the complexity of the supply chain. And, there is a lot of things going on here. Now, I will say there is definitely some really good benefits of doing this. For example, if you get your suppliers, you're working in purchase goods and services, and you get your suppliers or even your own company to start focusing on reduction of emissions. And usually it's important to note here that a supplier's scope 1 and 2, as well as their scope 3, is going to be your scope 3 if you're the entity, if that makes sense. And we're going to see that in a few minutes. We're going to look at a slide that kind of illustrates that. So any suppliers that you have in your purchase goods and services, and this also applies to service providers, okay? We're not just talking somebody that makes something, like basically providing a chemical ingredient. This could apply to consultant. We have companies that are saying, if we look at our scope 3 and we're doing kind of the spend-based analysis, we're seeing that our advertising agencies or our consultants are driving emissions in a big way. So by doing all this, if you start to do this measure and then you start to reduce, there's some really amazing operational improvements. That's what's exciting to me in our company is many of the folks we work with, when we come in and we're helping them, basically baseline their GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, we then say, all right, here's how you're going to get on a path for decarbonization. We start looking at where they can start reducing energy consumption. They start getting their suppliers on board, and they're starting to save energy and reduce emissions and reduce waste and all kinds of things. And there's a great way to save money and get cost savings across the board. So these are some of the things. I know that's a lot, but there's a lot going on right now. So sorry for all those words, but it's just, I really wanted to set the stage here on what's driving the market, and this will set us up for the rest of the discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Tad. And a lot of really key themes or topics that we'll dive into a lot further later on. One thing I know you mentioned, like the pharma sector, pharma industry is one that's really pushing for, or for example, like the setting of science-based targets and how it has trickle-down effects for suppliers. Are there other industries where you see this being really common?
Yeah, well, definitely the pharmaceutical industry, and we are seeing consumer products in a big way. Some of the consumer products companies are driving this. A lot of companies that are pushing science-based targets into their suppliers, that actually sets them up for maybe an easier way of tracking and determining that a company is truly committed to reductions. So that's definitely what we're seeing there. But consumer products for sure. Noah, I know you work a lot in the automotive. I don't know if automotive's been driving that yet and requiring science-based targets of their suppliers, but we are starting to see more of that. We did a webinar last week, and there were some folks on there from the telecommunications industry, and they're also starting to push the science-based targets down to, and more strict requirements on their suppliers. And I would say in the farm industry, like the letters that are coming out is requiring some of these tier 1 and top suppliers to actually have their science-based targets and their scope 1, 2, and 3 done by the end of 2025. So they don't have very much time.
Yeah, no, so some great insights there. And it's, yeah, I had kind of the same sentiment as you, especially on the SEC ruling that, it may have included some of the scope 3 elements of it. But the fact is that even if there isn't a regulatory framework that's requiring it, even some of these voluntary ones certainly are getting a lot more traction and requiring much more in-depth scope 3 reporting, for example, as well as setting of those targets. Next, I want to touch on challenges in emissions calculations. There's quite something we hear a lot of is data availability and actually getting access to this data from your suppliers. Going to pass it off to Noah just to talk about both the data availability challenge as well as various integration methods or how you can potentially get access to this data in a meaningful way.
Sure. Thanks, Mitch. I think lucky for us, the concept of data problems isn't new, and the concept of supply chain problems isn't new. I think unlucky for us is when it comes to carbon emissions and product carbon footprint, we see that there's a greater degree of collaboration needed than ever before, as well as a greater degree of data transparency needed to make this happen. So I see two main decision points here. At the enterprise level, so we'll start at the top. They have the ability to make a make-buy decision on their products. And of course, if they want to make, it stays with them. If they want to buy, that opens us up to the supply chain. And then the second decision point, and Tad will speak more to this later, being how then does a company help its supply chain improve, because they know that by accounting for those scope 3 purchase goods and services emissions, they now own those and they are responsible for them. So at the enterprise level, there's first challenges in, it'd be wonderful if we could make the assumption that every company has their supply chain fully mapped. They know where everything is at every time, but I think that's generally not the case. And with mapping these very large supply chains just becomes something that no one person can fully understand, something that necessarily has to be embodied in an IT system. And with that IT system, while an essential tool to run that business, it also needs to be supported by the proper framework. And then on the supplier side, we see difficulty in maintaining this data. When it comes to suppliers too, they generally don't have the sheer capital resources of this enterprise. So even if they are expected to report up their supply chain to the bigger OEM, it's often difficult to do so, because all they can focus on is, or all they feel like they can focus on is the production aspect, their margin. So when we get to these other critical decision-making factors, say it be quality, safety, carbon emissions has not yet climbed up the ladder to the point that it's critical. But I think some events of the past, like the COVID pandemic in 2020, I think it pointed out the scale of supply chain challenges. And I think it brought a lot of impetus to many industries that we need to care about supply chain volatility. And then layered on top of that, I think the climate crisis represents this second awakening of these sustainability metrics, and understanding like decarbonization throughout a supply chain and the ownership of those numbers. So I mean, on the previous slide, we saw that if Scope 3 accounts for up to 90% of a company's emissions, I think it's pretty hard to brush that under the rug. So I think, as well as challenges in data availability, I think we certainly have challenges in responsibility and in ownership of this data. And then the last piece on this slide, the data management providers. So at MHP, we work in the business transformation space with several different IT and technology tool providers, and it becomes very complicated very fast when we're working with data mapping tasks, when we're working with the integration of different systems, especially when we look at the enterprise level. These are very complex systems across often siloed departments, and then also with very strict master data governance, data privacy. Like that's a whole topic coming out of Europe with GDPR that's drastically different with the US. And since MHP, our headquarters is in Germany, we deal with this a lot internally, and then of course externally with different clients. So all of these are big challenges with data management that need to be considered, and they get unwieldy really fast. I feel like the complexity of introducing more data to try and calculate a KPI, it often doesn't increase linearly in complexity, but it increases exponentially in terms of the data we're mapping, trying to figure out where it's coming from, and then not to mention the economic decisions associated with that when we're trying to decide what data needs to be transmitted, how frequent it needs to be transmitted, and all of those considerations. So I think we could talk about challenges for quite a long time, but I think it'd be better to move on to the solution side of it, because I think there's a lot we've learned in terms of supply chain problems, and then there's also still a lot to learn and to collaborate with in the coming years to make sure that decarbonization happens at the pace that it needs to happen, and ensure that the right people take responsibility over their carbon emissions and ownership of this data.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I totally agree. No, I want to keep it positive and focus on some of the solutions and what organizations can do, even with these challenges that are in place. With that, yeah, I'll move on to the next slide too, just highlighting more of some of those obstacles that are certainly faced. And, this is more from an enterprise lens, or what enterprises are currently seeing and the challenges that exist. First and foremost, yeah, some data or getting access to data is definitely a problem. In some instances, companies or their suppliers just don't have it. They haven't reached a stage yet where they're calculating their emissions, or they're able to provide emissions data. And because of that, enterprises will have limited insight into like the impact, initiatives, and progress and what's going on within their supply chain. Certainly maturity as well, really linked to that same data problem, that suppliers lack either the expertise, resources, or access to even their own data to do these calculations, to be able to measure it, manage it, and report it up the supply chain. Another one definitely is relationships, where making sure that you have kind of bridged the gap and are working within your supply chain to build that relationship with your suppliers to bring them along the same journey that you're going on. So giving them the resources, the tooling to actually do the calculations that you need for your supply chain emissions is definitely a key challenge, and something that certainly can be very dynamic and something to manage. The final one I'll highlight is communication. So making sure that there is key collaboration or opportunities to work back and forth between those companies and platforms can be a real challenge in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. Really need a strong tool or something in place to make sure that you have those communication lines set up and can work directly with your suppliers to get access to what they're doing, and at the same time, help them move the needle, help them start to really lean into decarbonization at the same pace that you're requiring. Tad, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would definitely like to say that, we see when we talk about maturity, this is something that you have to look at. Definitely the enterprises, many of the enterprises have a lot of resources. They might have a whole sustainability team that, basically can work on these things. But then as you look at suppliers, many suppliers could be smaller companies, they just don't have the resources and they don't have the same level of understanding of what, we're even talking about on this webinar today. So we definitely see that maturity is really critical in terms of understanding that in your supply chain. And just so everybody understands, like some of these enterprises could have 70,000 suppliers. Okay. So, they're not all tier 1 or tier 2, but if you look across the whole chain there, we're talking a lot of different suppliers involved. So imagine you're going to have if you have the enterprise and you have like larger companies that are supplying things like maybe chemical companies or, others, they might have some resources and they've started measuring all these things. But then you have a smaller company that has never done this. They don't have a dedicated sustainability team. They haven't been required to do it. Then suddenly they get a questionnaire or a letter in the mail that says, oh, we need you to report your scope 1, 2, and 3, and then set science-based targets. So it's really important to understand what that maturity level is and give. One thing that we've created, we created a scope 3 training academy that we basically can, guide suppliers depending on their maturity level across different steps there. And that's where the importance here to, really getting good success here is that collaboration. And Mitch, you definitely said it well about the relationship, building that relationship with the suppliers, and then being able to get the data in an effective manner. And, most people, I'm going to say that probably 90% of the world is using spreadsheets, to measure a lot of this. So being able to guide those suppliers on what is the greenhouse gas protocol and what is a scope 1 and 2 and what's a scope 3, getting them to understand that. And then when the ones that have already done that, then they're the ones that you have to work with on reduction. And that's huge here. Measuring, managing, and reporting is big. And that's step 1 here. But then for the success of anybody, if you've got huge scope 3 footprint and you're making a science-based target to say you're going to reduce your emissions near term and then long term, you're going to be net zero. If your suppliers aren't working along with you, you are not going to achieve any reductions because you have no control over that supply chain. So I'm just wanting to point out here that good data is really critical too. And I'm hearing a lot from the, folks that are going to have to report to these regulations eventually, that they're nervous about just giving estimates. They want really solid data. So getting primary data, we're going to talk a lot about that. How do we get that primary data from our suppliers? How do you, as an enterprise, get your legal team to feel confident that the data you're getting is something you're going to be comfortable reporting to a government agency? So a lot to talk about there as we continue the webinar today.
Yeah.
Well said. To add a note to the data side, well, I think more of the world's run on 2007 Excel than we'd like to think. But I think you said it well, that like data quality is critical here, both for the communication side of it and then also for the trustworthiness side of it from the business. They want to trust that the data they're putting out there is correct for when this becomes something that's going to be audited in the future. And I've noticed it's something similar to, say, like regulations in the climate space. Over like the 2010s, we saw it go through this huge growth, this large amount of 4-letter acronyms, and then finally in the past few years, a bit of consolidation. And the product carbon footprint space, I would say, is still in like the growth phase, if not teetering on that consolidation. But we still see the greenhouse gas protocol, the Pathfinder framework, and then a few different things within ISO 14000, all talking about carbon footprint, but all in a slightly different way. And I think Tad said it well, that those nuances are are small and hard to understand, but big in impact when when you're passing a number between many different hands. It's like playing a game of telephone, and you're going to end up with a drastically different number at the end than what you started with at the beginning without this focus on data quality. So
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, definitely a key theme that we've talked about too in terms of making sure that you have the highest available data quality, and it's something that you are monitoring and making sure you're continually looking to improve on. I want to just spend some time next talking about choosing the right calculation method. So under GHG protocol for purchase goods and services, there are 4 different ways you can do these calculations. First one being the spend-based proxy. And I would say this is where most organizations start, where you're using an emission factor set, something like US EPA, EEIO, or XEO base, where you're taking your spend data, applying it against the correct category, and getting an emission number. Now, I think it's a great place to start. It lets you identify critical hotspots within your supply chain and really enable a strategy. However, it is not that precise. You're not getting emissions from your specific supply chain or able to identify specific challenges or hotspots based on your supplier's specific emissions. But again, it does let you build a strategy. It does let you start this process. Next is activity-based. And I would say, moving from left to right, this is almost like a maturity curve where as organizations become more mature and are looking to really enable their suppliers, they're moving up these methods on an ongoing basis. Activity-based, I'd say the real pro here, or the argument for it, is that it's more specific to the material composition or material categories for your emissions or your commodities that you're purchasing. However, you're still using industry average emission factors. So it's not going to reflect your specific supplier operations and their direct emissions. However, it is still, one level more accurate. It gives you one further lens or insight into your specific supply chain. Next is hybrid, where this kind of balances that accuracy with robustness. It'll reflect allocated scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's either primary or proxy upstream emissions from your suppliers, and allows you to, mix kind of the activity-based or spend-based emissions with actual data from your suppliers. I would say for larger enterprises, this is where we're seeing most of them move towards, is that we're trying to get this data or publicly reported data pulled into their emissions calculations. And it's one of the things that, leveraging software and tooling can really help with that. For example, our purchase goods and services calculator will pull and, scrape information from the web to be able to then add that to or get real data with the same pieces of information you're going to be using, for example, for spend-based. Really allows organizations to take a strong step forward and really dive into and start to engage with those suppliers in a meaningful way. That approach, again, is something we see organizations move more towards as their programs continue to evolve and grow. The last method would be supplier specific. This one is where you're getting that data from your suppliers. Can be product level data, can be something like LCAs, can be something like their direct emissions allocated to you, where this is really key, again, going back to that data challenge, making sure that suppliers are mature enough doing the correct calculations to really pull this data in and give you something meaningful. Right now, I would say most suppliers can't provide this level of detail of this data, and it's not yet a reasonable expectation at scale for some supply chains. Now, that can differ based on sector, based on industry, and what you're requesting of suppliers. But yeah, as of what I've seen right now, it hasn't been a great approach at scale. Moving along to the specific strategies. Tad, I might hand it over to you at this point, just to walk through the challenges with primary data, proxy data, and even diving into some LCAs.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you reflect back on what Mitch just said, the ultimate holy grail right now would be, definitely getting that supplier specific data. And what we call that is primary data. So the evolution of this whole movement is, taking some time here. And we definitely want to see more and more activity around suppliers actually measuring their scope 1 and 2. And one thing to point out is in that slide that Mitch just showed, if you read the greenhouse gas protocols and follow those, basically there is a requirement in your scope 3 to do continuous improvement on your data. So Mitch is 100% right. Most companies are starting at the spend-based method, then they're going to go basically to average data method or activity-based. Then they'll go to hybrid, and then they will definitely look to get more supplier specific. So one thing that I mentioned earlier, when companies, the enterprises are pushing down and saying they want these companies to measure scope 1, 2, and 3, and they want them to set science-based targets. In addition to that, they also want them to be able to report that information. And we're seeing a lot of that activity right now. So primary data would be, for any of you who are on here, let's say you're a supplier to somebody, your primary data would be your scope 1 and 2 data for sure. And then you should be also getting an understanding, at least through a spend-based analysis and doing a hotspot to understand what your scope 3 emissions are in terms of what you do as a company. And then ultimately, you would be reporting those into either CDP or EcoVadis or whatever platform the enterprises are requiring to be utilized here. And it's important that we understand here that primary data would be that real data right from you, the supplier. And there's different ways we can do this. You can basically collect all that information, or understanding that many of you suppliers might be not just supplying one enterprise. So if you see the word here, allocation, trying to understand, let's say you make 1 billion widgets a year or whatever, 1 billion pounds of something, and you're selling it out to 25 different enterprises, you got to allocate then your emissions to them. So that's the complexity of how we look at these supply chain strategies. But being able to get the primary data is critical. There are different companies, enterprises that I know that are basically sending information and letters to their suppliers, basically saying they want them to do life cycle assessment. And life cycle assessment is an excellent way to understand the impacts of your product and operations. However, it is a snapshot in time, right? And the thing is, you're going to be continually changing that data. So you're going to need to keep that data updated. And a life cycle assessment is essentially looking at your impacts from at least cradle to gate or cradle to grave. So that would be definitely capturing your scope 1 and 2 and your scope 3. And ultimately, like many of the chemical companies, for example, are saying, we want our suppliers to do life cycle assessment and provide us what's called a product carbon footprint. And that would then be able to disclose all those emissions from, the scope 3 of that supplier to their gate, essentially give that information out there. So when people are trying to understand this, it's the first step would be, let's measure everything. Let's start to allocate. And when you see the term here, proxy data, what that would mean is there's various databases out there that we can go out to and use industry averages. For example, we do a lot of life cycle assessment in our company. So let's say that I want to know the impact of the GWP, or global warming potential, of making a ton of steel or a ton of cement. I can go into our LCA databases and I can actually get data that will tell me an emission factor to say, for every ton of steel made in a certain type of furnace, it would be X kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And we can do the same thing with many other things. So that's where those average data things come in that Mitch has been talking about. And you can see how they're not accurate, right? Because it's not specifically from the supplier. I'm going to tell more of an example of this when I do the case study, but I'm just trying to set the background on what a lot of this terminology means here and how you might utilize these different things. But the top one there, primary data, that's where every enterprise and everybody wants to get to. So it's definitely the ultimate holy grail there.
Yeah, for sure. And with that primary data too, I also really like the explanation you gave there about LCAs and really it being a snapshot in time. I want to link it back to what you started talking about kind of at the beginning of the call, with like the goal really being decarbonization, and the goal really being that you can track, monitor, and measure what your suppliers are doing in terms of decarbonization. Now, an LCA is a great snapshot in time, But in order to build out a program where you can really see that progress, really see your suppliers decarbonize, that's where we need to get to that primary data. And whether that's them publicly reporting to CDP and you allocating your emissions across that, being able to see the progress and see what they're doing or what your suppliers are doing is really the only way that you're going to be able to move the needle and really push for decarbonization within your supply chain.
Yeah, and I want to say too, the life cycle, the great thing about a life cycle assessment is it definitely gives you a lot of insights into where those environmental impacts are, right? Because the nice thing about it, you're looking at each life cycle stage, so you'll know exactly what your raw material stage would be, like your scope 3, your suppliers. It'll give you an idea of what that is, and then you can slice and dice that down to say what are the primary materials that are driving those impacts based on the life cycle. You'll really know where your scope 1 and 2 stacks up in the whole life cycle. And then you'll know like the transportation stage of getting those raw materials to your facility, et cetera. So it is a great tool for identifying where the additional hotspots and where to focus. And then you're right, Mitch, it is absolute that there's got to be continuous annually, at least, reporting of how those reductions are happening in the decarbonization. So.
Yeah, I think to add to that, like even with, like as we see more advanced IT tools and this increase of primary data, like life cycle assessments are going to remain as an essential like proof of concept and statistical tool during the design phase of products and during like the validation and auditing of this carbon emissions.
Yeah, certainly. I'll pass it off now to Tad, just to walk through a case study and understanding this company's Scope 3 emissions.
Yeah, so I know we're throwing out a lot of terms, and some of you might be very familiar with what we're talking about here, but others might not totally get this. So I wanted to put together some visuals here. This is based on we do a lot of Scope 3 analysis for the chemical sector. And this is basically something that you're able to get for free. It's basically an industry document that shows what's going on in terms of where are the hot spots when it comes to your Scope 3 emissions. And this is based on CDP data, like assessing all types of chemical industries just to see what typically is coming out. And as you can see here, purchased goods and services comes out to about 43.97% of the chemical sector's emissions. And then the next big one would be use of sold products. That's usually a big challenge depending on where these materials go. And then end of life treatment are the big slices here. So when you do your Scope 3 hotspot and you're understanding where those areas are, this would tell me, all right, I'm going to zoom in on purchased goods and services, and I'm going to try to, I've used this sector analysis. It confirms with what I've done. But as Mitch said, the first thing I would do is I would do my spend-based analysis, to get there. If we go to the next slide, Mitch, I'll kind of reinforce that. So after, we're doing the baselining, we're getting that feel for where our Scope 3 emissions are. And in the, purchased goods and services sector, then I usually am starting out at the very bottom there with the spend-based method. So what that means is I'm going to say, all right, I purchased X kilograms of something in a year, and there's economic input-output data I can use from EPA and others that I could say the emission factor associated with this particular thing that I bought, let's just say it's cement again, I can then get a value there. So that's going to help me to get that pie chart, and that's going to help me also to understand what does that purchased goods and services look like if I'm going to slice and dice that. But as I move up here, I'm going to start to refine this data even more. And like I said, the GHG protocol is definitely pushing us to move up the hierarchy here. And you can see in this image, like some of you, I'm seeing some of the questions coming in on the chat here. You can see there supplier Scope 1 and 2, and then you see all other upstream emissions. That's the Scope 3 on the left there. So being able to get that primary data is really good, and starting out with average data is great. So if we continue to look at this, we'll know that eventually as our suppliers get more mature, we get more data, we get more understanding of all this, we're going to start to be able to get better data as we climb up the chain here and start to refine these estimates really well. And if we go to the next slide, we can always pop back to this if we need to. This is sanitized, but this is like a real snapshot of us taking that purchase goods and services slice and saying, all right, where do I want to focus, right? So this is one thing that you can do. Remember, I said some supplier or some enterprises might have 70,000 suppliers. So obviously they're not going to go to all 70,000 and say, hey, we want you to give us this primary data right away. They're going to do an analysis and they're going to say, of my purchase goods and services, what are the biggest contributors to purchase goods and services? In that example, it was like 44%. What are the biggest contributors? So you do another slice, maybe based on looking at that, that spend data, spend based, or maybe you have the ability to use like average data method where you know the volume of what was purchased and you can multiply that by a better emission factor than just economic input. And then you come up with this, and we can see here chemical A and chemical B are by far a huge percentage of my overall impact there. So what I would be doing here is saying, all right, chemical A, let's say there's 20 suppliers of chemical A and 50 suppliers of chemical B. I would make them my top tier that I'd be focusing on, and I'd be trying to really work with them collaboratively, like we talked about, or train them on what you need, give them that training and guidance so they can actually report their scope 1 and 2 as a minimum, and then eventually scope 3, and then get that information and use that to drive forward here in terms of continuously getting better data, getting more comfortable with what you have there. And I can give a quick example here. In the, let's say in the materials, like, goods like doors, hardware, building products, we do a lot of work in that sector. And if you use economic input output data for, say, steel, you might get a very large emission factor on steel. But in reality, when you actually go into a hybrid method and you start to use data from like an LCA software, you're gonna see that kilograms CO2 equivalent per unit per ton of steel going down. But ultimately, we've worked with a couple companies to be able to go to the exact manufacturer of the steel, and you start to get that data. And I've seen tremendous drops in the amount of emissions that in scope 3. But that's why this is like an ongoing process. You're gonna do your initial estimates, and you're gonna keep diving in, and then keep working with those suppliers to try to get that primary data. And we definitely do use Sustain Life for this, and we really like it when the suppliers, we can either use Sustain Life and go out and grab data right from CDP or others where we know that some of the more mature suppliers have already reported, or for those suppliers that haven't done it, getting them to report into there. Eventually, we're going to get better data going forward here. But this is definitely a good example of the methodology. And I know there's a lot of other challenges in other sectors, and I think, Noah, you have some insights on this as well. So.
Yeah, Mitch, if you want to go back 2 slides, I think just a brief note, I think or back one more. The pie chart's interesting, and the differences between industries are interesting because naturally every industry, whether it's business to consumer, business to business, it has a different spread here. And the CDP's done studies, so this information is already available at a high level. And I think from like an academic perspective, and for any sustainability professionals out there, it's interesting to know that and understand it. But the automotive industry in particular is a very interesting case study in this split of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, because it's changing so quickly. Because the automotive industry, for now, in like a conventional sense, is like 60–70% use of sold products, and then the next biggest being purchased goods and services. But with the transition to electric vehicles, we see that use of sold products category being, I would say, managed and cut down a significant amount. But that's where we see common critiques then in the industry of, okay, so we're cutting down on the use phase of the product, but what about this? What about that? Like there's a lot of critiques out there. And I think this is a reason we can see that, because the companies they're currently focusing on the largest slice of the pie, or that which they have direct control over, scope 1 and 2. But since that is switching at such a dramatic pace, it's requiring automotive to address this and to understand how to have this purchase goods and services, this supply chain responsibility at a much more rapid rate, which is very interesting. And I think it's similar across other industries too, because we see a lot of business use case pivots, like a lot due to the climate crisis, because there's it's necessitating a lot of change, a lot of difference in business models, and that's drastically changing here. And to switch like the slices of the pie too, I wanted to briefly make a note that by accounting for purchased goods and services, it also allows a company to incentivize their suppliers that are using cutting edge technologies, that are putting a focus on this. And it's just like the decrease of carbon emissions. We need to reach the point of drawdown and continue to decrease, but we also need to increase that response, that mitigation, and that carbon reduction. We need to incentivize those technologies that are like making a change, and that's where accounting for purchased goods and services is really critical. And I think the automotive industry especially is waking up to that.
Yeah, really great insights there, Noah and Tad. I totally agree that, you know, the switch of that piece of the pie does mean more meaningful action, especially, you know, focusing on the bigger piece being purchased goods and services does require meaningful action from your suppliers, and is a key component of making a successful decarbonization program. Want to go through key takeaways, then we do have a Q&A section at the end. Want to make sure we have enough time for that. But some of the key takeaways to highlight and hope what people walk away from is that certainly supply chain emissions are very key in order for us to move towards decarbonization and resilient future. Regulations are key drivers that we're seeing this be a key component that is requiring Scope 3 emissions reporting, is requiring suppliers to report their emissions to their customers. Managing supply chains emissions certainly can be challenging. Getting the right data, getting the team, or sorry, your suppliers on board and on the same page as you to be able to report these emissions is certainly a challenge. When doing that and when starting to engage with suppliers, picking the correct method for calculation based on your intended outcome is really a key to building the successful program. That, you know, starting with spend-based, I think is a fantastic approach, that it'll give you the insights and allow you to look at various hotspots in your supply chain and build a strategy around it. That shouldn't be a barrier to starting this. And you know, that last point there around don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Even just starting with spend-based allows you to build a strategy, allows you to start to move the needle. You know, kind of the holy grail, like Tad was saying, is that primary data, but not everyone's going to be able to get there quickly or as quickly as I'm sure they would like. But even just starting with that spend base and being able to report those emissions numbers and being able to build a strategy around that is a great place to start. We'll jump into Q&A next. First question we have here is, what we are in our clients' Scope 3 reporting. When reporting to our clients, do I include my own Scope 3 or just my Scope 1 and 2? Tad, I might hand this off to you, and we can probably scroll back up to this slide as well to answer that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say the first thing that we're doing with most suppliers as part of, like when we do our training academy with them, we're getting them to do Scope 1 and 2 first, because Scope 3 is definitely more complex, and you know, that's a huge step forward. Even a lot of the large enterprise companies started out doing Scope 1 and 2 initially. You will then want to do your Scope 3, and you know, that's definitely as you continue to mature and get, you know, moving along. But a lot of things we're talking about today is once you actually follow the greenhouse gas protocol, you get your Scope 1 and 2 measured, you're reporting it to, you know, the enterprises you're supplying or whatever, then you would want to start with the Scope 3. But I usually don't encourage, especially if you're just starting this journey, I don't encourage you to dive in immediately on Scope 3. Do your Scope 1 and 2 first, but then Scope 3 would be right behind it. And, you know, doing these different methodologies, like Mitch said, it's not going to be perfect, but being able to get an initial feel for what categories are the biggest categories. In this case, we're talking purchase goods and services today, looking at that purchase goods and services and being able to understand what materials or things in your purchase goods and services are making up the biggest pieces of the pie, just like we showed on that slide, looking at the different chemicals, starting to understand that, and then trying to calculate that or work with your suppliers. And we don't have the slide in here, but we have like this slide that shows the enterprise up here and everything driving them. And then we show their suppliers, and then we show that every supplier they have has suppliers, and every supplier has suppliers. So it's this giant web of connection. But again, you can definitely start out though with some of the sector documents just to get a feel for where you're going to be. And then if you work closely with your procurement team, you can start to even journey down that scope 3 path of just looking at what are we spending the most money on. That's a great way to start, in terms of those things, and give you that idea of what your scope 3 responsibility might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. Moving on to the next question too. This one is, if suppliers have limited capital to complete emissions measurement, what is a better use of their dollars? A standard scope 1, 2, and 3 inventory, or focusing solely on LCAs? I'll take this one first, and then, Tad or Noah, if you have anything to add, please feel free. But in my opinion, it really depends on the business objective of the program. Are you focusing on or trying to truly decarbonize your supply chain? Or is it something that, you're getting your own customer requests for emissions based on product carbon footprint, or what those specific products you sell to them look like? If your goal really is decarbonization and to build a robust program, build that relationship like we were talking, I would lean more towards doing a full scope 1, 2, 3 inventory. It will allow for tracking of meaningful action on an ongoing basis. And it'll also allow for a meaningful conversation between you and your suppliers that, it's not going to happen in a vacuum. I think, as Tad mentioned, that scope 3 kind of workshop series and things that they do with the suppliers is a really great avenue to build a robust program that you're going to get continual data and be able to track and monitor success. Again, with those LCAs, it is a snapshot in time. And it's something that in order to see progress or see and have meaningful conversations, you need to do it on an ongoing basis. And the LCA process it's not super easy or straightforward. It does take a bit of commitment and time from both parties. So just making sure that I would probably lean more towards doing a full scope 1, 2, 3 inventory with your suppliers, and really enabling and helping them to provide those numbers to you on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I would support that, Mitch. And what we typically advise is when companies do have limited resources, we strongly recommend they do the scope 1 and 2 initially, then dive into scope 3. And the beautiful thing about that is once you do all that, that is actually data you need to do your LCA in the future. Because that would then feed in if you are going to do a full LCA ever, you want to take a deeper dive, or you do say you get a request from someone that says, we want you to do a product carbon footprint or a full LCA to meet these requirements, then you would have your scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's a huge chunk of the data you need to eventually run that LCA. And it also gives you many insights that you could start doing things before you even get the LCA done in terms of, driving your direction. So it's definitely a good recommendation. And, a lot of times if companies say they want to do an LCA, we probably in parallel will do their scope 1, 2, and 3 at the same time. It just depends on what they have to do there. So.
Yeah, for sure. I'll just go through our last question here with the minute or so we have left. I think this is a great one for a lot of folks on the call, and it's any suggested ways to motivate suppliers to provide their emissions data. I think it's a great question, and the challenge that a lot of folks are having. You really have, there's kind of two approaches we typically see: the carrot or the stick. I am much more, hopefully leaning towards the carrot approach, where you can really enable suppliers through, for example, series of workshops and webinars to educate them first and foremost, let them know, here's what we're doing. We're asking for your scope 1 and 2 emission data, maybe to start providing them with tooling. Maybe it's a playbook, maybe it's software, like our supplier module does as well. but it really gives them the access to and lets them start the process. And then there's also the stick approach where, as we saw in the pharmaceutical industry, it's one that we've seen come a little commonly, and the wording on their contracts and things like that can be a little scary at time. And that, is a strong way to motivate suppliers. Just in closing, Tad or Noah, anything to add to that?
I would definitely say that collaboration is key, right? And it's a collaborative approach, and education is also really key. Getting the suppliers to understand that this doesn't have to be as scary, like you said, Mitch. Having a good training or a playbook or a platform to help them do this is really important. So that collaboration will definitely drive the change, and it will definitely get that relationship, as you talked about earlier. Building that relationship is really key to move forward here. And these suppliers have to understand that by doing this and building that relationship with you, it's going to help them to basically maintain the business in the future. And it's also going to help them to be more competitive, because there will be times that people are going to say, hey, the way I'm going to reduce is I'm going to find those companies that have actually done some things to reduce those emissions and can tell me about it. Or, maybe they're going to start saying, now I don't have to use less of your material. Like, there's a lot of different ways you can reduce your scope 3, and you want to be working collaboratively.
Yeah, I think the last note to that is just to keep the end goal in mind: climate action, drawdown, and reducing global warming, making sure we're rewarding those effective climate technologies and incentivizing those throughout the supply chain and throughout all business. And I think that goal is critical.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank both of you, Noah and Tad, as well as all of our guests on the call. Really appreciate the time today, and we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.